In March of 1983, in Geneva, Switzerland, two men went for a walk. One of them was Leslie Gelb, a former senior official of the United States State Department, who had covered arms control negotiations for the Carter administration and was now working as a journalist for the New York Times. He was in Geneva covering the latest round of negotiations on intermediate-range nuclear forces, the Pershing II, and cruise missiles that NATO was planning to deploy in Western Europe, and that the Soviet Union was spending enormous political energy trying to prevent. The other man was Marshal Nikolai Vasilyevich Ogarkov, chief of the General Staff of the Soviet Union, the highest military office in the Soviet armed forces, answerable only to the defense minister and the Politburo. Ogarkov had been marshal since 1977, chief of the General Staff since 1977, one of the most powerful military figures in a country that organized its entire national purpose around military power. He had graduated from the Voroshilov Academy of the General Staff. He had overseen Soviet operations in Afghanistan. He had planned for war against NATO. He knew in precise technical and operational detail what the Soviet military could do and what it could not do. During their walk, Gelb asked Ogarkov about the Strategic Defense Initiative, President Reagan's announcement made just days earlier of an American research program to develop missile defense. Ogarkov did not respond with the prepared lines Soviet officials were trained to give. He told Gelb something that Gelb considered so significant and so sensitive that he held it in confidence for 9 years and did not publish it until 1992. Ogarkov said, "We cannot equal the quality of US arms for a generation or two. Modern military power is based on technology, and technology is based on computers. In the United States, small children play with computers. Here we do not even have them in every office of the Defense Ministry, and for reasons you know well, we cannot make computers widely available in our society. We will never be able to catch up with you in modern arms until we have an economic revolution. And the question is whether we can have an economic revolution without a political revolution." He said this in 1983. He was still chief of the General Staff. He was saying it to an American journalist, off the record, in a private conversation, in a park in Switzerland. He was, in that conversation, diagnosing not just the Soviet military's problem, but the Soviet system's fundamental and probably terminal structural flaw. The impossibility of building 21st century weapons with a 19th century economy wrapped in a political system that could not survive the openness that a modern economy required. 16 months later, on September 6, 1984, the Politburo fired him. This is a story about the price of being right. Nikolai Ogarkov was born on October 30th, 1917, in the village of Molokovo in Tver Governorate, an agricultural region a few hundred kilometers northwest of Moscow. Peasant country, not a place that produced generals in any quantity. His family was poor. At 14, he left to work as a seller's apprentice at a military cooperative in the Soviet Far East. He joined the Red Army. He fought in World War II. He was not born into privilege or position. He built his career the way Soviet military careers were built in that era, through performance, through organizational loyalty, through the kind of demonstrated competence that the Soviet military bureaucracy could recognize and reward in officers who knew how to navigate its structure without threatening it. By the mid-1970s, Ogarkov was first deputy chief of the General Staff. He had been part of the Soviet delegation to SALT negotiations. He had a view of American military power that was based not on ideology, but on systematic study, on the technical specifications of American weapons systems, on the operational doctrine that the American Army was developing under General Dupuy at Tradoc, on the precision-guided munitions and surveillance systems, and networked command and control architectures that American defense laboratories were producing at a pace that Soviet military analysts were tracking with increasing alarm. What Ogarkov saw when he looked at American military technology in the late 1970s and early 1980s was not simply a gap in specific weapons. He saw a structural advantage that derived from the American economy's relationship with computing technology. The United States had built its military transformation, the revolution in military affairs that was making its weapons more precise, more lethal, more effective, on a foundation of digital processing capability that the American civilian economy was generating in abundance. The same companies making computers for American households and offices were supplying the components that made American precision-guided munitions work. The same academic culture that trained American computer scientists was producing the engineers who designed American command and control systems. The civilian and military technology ecosystems were connected in ways that made the American military's technological capacity effectively limitless, bounded only by what the American economy could generate, which was turning out to be a great deal. The Soviet military had no equivalent foundation. Soviet computing technology was a generation or two behind American computing technology, not because Soviet engineers were incompetent, they were not, but because the Soviet economic system could not produce computers at scale, at quality, at the cost that would allow them to be embedded throughout the military and civilian infrastructure the way American computers were. The Soviet government had, at various points in its history, treated cybernetics, the science of computing and information systems, as ideologically suspect, as a bourgeois capitalist pseudoscience. The damage this had done to Soviet computer science in the 1950s had never been fully repaired. The Soviet computer industry, by the 1980s, had largely given up on original design and was cloning Western systems, copying the IBM architecture rather than developing its own, while producing components at quality standards and prices so inferior to Western equivalents that Soviet microprocessors cost 10 times what the same chips cost in the West, while performing worse. Ogarkov understood the military implication of this gap with complete clarity. It was not a gap that more defense spending could close because the gap was not primarily in defense spending. It was a gap in the civilian technological base that military technology was built on. To close the gap, the Soviet Union would need to transform its civilian economy in ways that would require relaxing the state control of information that the Soviet system depended on for its political survival. Computers, freely available, meant information, freely available. Information freely available was what the KGB and the Central Committee existed to prevent. The military needed the kind of technological openness that the political system could not permit. He was still saying this privately in 1983, but he had been arguing the position in various forms through official Soviet military channels for years. In 1982, he published a book through the Soviet military press titled "Always in Readiness to Defend the Fatherland" that argued, in terms careful enough to pass the censors but clear enough to anyone who understood military technology, that the American military was developing a new generation of conventional precision weapons that would fundamentally alter the character of war, and that the Soviet military needed to transform itself doctrinally and technically to respond. In the same year, he articulated what he called the military technical revolution, a concept that described how precision-guided munitions, automated command systems, and reconnaissance strike complexes were combining to make conventional weapons as destructive as low-yield nuclear weapons in certain scenarios. The concept was, in retrospect, one of the most prescient pieces of strategic analysis produced by any military thinker of the Cold War era. It anticipated with striking accuracy the way the American military actually fought in the Gulf War of 1991 and subsequent conflicts. The problem was not the concept. The problem was the conclusion that followed from the concept, which was that the Soviet military could not implement it. Without an economic transformation, the Soviet political system could not permit. Ogarkov kept arguing. In May 1984, he published an article in the Soviet Army newspaper Krasnaya Zvezda that is described across multiple military history accounts as the proximate trigger for his dismissal. The article outlined his vision for modernizing the Soviet military around new technology. It was not a dissident document, it was a military analysis published in the official organ of the Soviet Armed Forces by the Chief of the General Staff. But its argument that Western developments in rapid information gathering and dissemination on the battlefield had changed the nature of warfare, and that the Soviet military was inadequately prepared for this, was too explicit about Soviet inadequacy to be comfortable for the men who ran the system. On September 6, 1984, the Politburo dismissed Ogarkov as Chief of the General Staff and as First Deputy Minister of Defense. The official reasons given were, as Soviet official reasons generally were, bureaucratically vague. Multiple analysts who have studied the dismissal have pointed to multiple contributing factors. Olgarkov had become associated through personal connection with Grigory Romanov, who was competing for the succession to the ailing General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko, and whose political position collapsed before Chernenko died. The Politburo was also concerned about Olgarkov's institutional ambitions. He had weakened the main political administration, the organization that kept the military under party control, and had gained access to the Defense Council through unconventional means. His advocacy for increased defense spending had made him uncomfortable allies and uncomfortable enemies in equal measure. But the deeper problem was the argument itself. The Foreign Affairs analysis of Olgarkov's dismissal, published in 1988, makes this explicit. His continued stridency, and particularly his willingness to challenge the civilian leadership publicly on the defense spending issue, appears to have been one of the prime reasons for his removal. The civilian leadership did not want a chief of the general staff who kept publishing his view that the Soviet military was falling behind, because that view implied that the civilian leadership's economic management had failed, and implications of that kind were precisely what the Politburo could not tolerate. Olgarkov was reassigned to command the Western Theater of Military Operations, a significant military position, not a disgrace in the formal sense, but a removal from the strategic center of Soviet decision-making. He was replaced as Chief of the General Staff by Marshal Sergei Akhromeyev, a man who would later become one of the most important figures of the Gorbachev-era's arms control negotiations and who would ultimately take his own life the day after the failed coup attempt against Gorbachev in August 1991. The Geneva conversation with Gelb stayed secret. The Krasnaya Zvezda article existed in the public record but was read in the West primarily as a sign of internal Soviet military politics rather than as the strategic admission it actually was. The Politburo had fired the man most capable of articulating the Soviet Union's fundamental technological problem, and in doing so had removed the internal pressure for the kind of economic transformation that might have addressed it. 14 months after Olgarkov's dismissal, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary. Gorbachev had been cultivated in part by Yuri Andropov, who had seen in him a willingness to acknowledge that the Soviet system needed fundamental reform. Andropov was dead. He had died in February 1984, after only 15 months in office, most of them spent confined to a medical clinic outside Moscow with kidney failure. But the argument he had endorsed, that the Soviet Union's economic stagnation was a structural problem, not a management problem, not a fixable problem within the existing political framework, was the argument that Gorbachev would eventually act on. It was also, in its military dimension, essentially Olgarkov's argument. The connection between Olgarkov's analysis and Gorbachev's eventual reforms is not a straight line because history does not work in straight lines, but it is a traceable connection. The De Defensa analysis of the Gelb conversation notes explicitly that the reformists of the Soviet military in Olgarkov's orbit were aligned with Gorbachev, that Olgarkov's vision for a technologically transformed Soviet military was the military dimension of the economic transformation that Gorbachev would attempt to implement through perestroika. Olgarkov saw the problem first in its military form. Gorbachev eventually confronted the same problem in its economic and political form. Neither of them succeeded in solving it because the problem was not solvable within the Soviet system. What makes Olgarkov a figure for this particular kind of history, the history of the people who understood something important and were removed from power for understanding it, is the precision of his analysis. He was not a dissident. He was not a reformer in any ideological sense. He was a career military officer, a loyalist to the Soviet state, a man who had spent his professional life serving the system that dismissed him. What he understood was not that the system was wrong in any moral or philosophical sense. What he understood was that the system could not build the weapons it needed to remain competitive, because the weapons it needed to remain competitive required a civilian technology base that the system could not generate without becoming a different kind of system. He understood in 1983 that the Soviet military would lose the technological competition with the United States unless the Soviet Union had an economic revolution, and he understood, in the same breath, that an economic revolution probably required a political revolution, and he understood that a political revolution meant the end of the system he served. He said this to an American journalist who kept it secret for 9 years. He published a version of it in a Soviet military newspaper. He was fired 6 weeks after the newspaper article appeared. Leslie Gelb published the private conversation in the New York Times on August 20th, 1992. He titled the piece, "Who Won the Cold War?" The Soviet Union had ceased to exist 8 months earlier. Olgarkov was still alive. He would die in Moscow on January 23, 1994, and was not asked for his views on the question Gelb was posing. The question had been answered in a way that confirmed every specific prediction Olgarkov had made about the direction of the competition, while the man who made those predictions was watching from a theater command post in Western Russia, removed from the center of decisions almost a decade before the decisions ran out. The American military that fought in the Gulf War in January and February of 1991 was, in its essential character, the military that Olgarkov had described in his 1982 and 1984 publications: precision-guided munitions, automated command systems, reconnaissance strike complexes, the fusion of surveillance and lethality into a single networked system that could find a target and destroy it with a precision that made the mass tank formations of World War II doctrine obsolete. Olgarkov had seen it coming before it arrived. He had argued inside the Soviet system that the Soviet military needed to meet it. He was fired for arguing this. Richard Clarke, the American counter-terrorism official and defense analyst, wrote a novel years later in which he characterized Olgarkov as the first Soviet military leader who realized that the gap had gotten so wide that they could not catch up. The characterization is accurate in substance, though in the way of novel writing, it compresses a more complicated story into a cleaner arc. The gap that Olgarkov identified was not purely military. It was the gap between a system built on the free exchange of information and the commercial incentives that drove technological innovation, and a system built on the controlled distribution of information and the bureaucratic incentives that drove institutional self-preservation. He identified it from inside the second system, speaking about the first system using language that the second system could not tolerate. Nikolai Olgarkov was born in a peasant village in 1917, the year the Soviet state came into existence. He rose through the institution that the Soviet state built to project its power. He became the highest military officer of that state. He understood what the American system could do that his own system could not. He said so. He was removed. He was buried with full military honors at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. In January 1994, a memorial plaque at his former residence in Moscow identifies him as a hero of the Soviet Union. The museum in his birthplace village of Molokovo is named for him. His concept of the military technical revolution was adopted and renamed by American defense theorists who called it the revolution in military affairs and used it to organize the American military's technological transformation through the 1990s and 2000s. The transformation that produced the military that fought the wars of the 21st century. The Soviet military never got to build the force he described. The country that would have built it ceased to exist before the first components could be fielded at scale. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit the like button. The Gelb Conversation, 9 years secret, then published in a newspaper on a summer Sunday in 1992 as a question about who won a Cold War that had just ended, is one of the most precise private admissions by any senior military official of any power in the history of the 20th century. Olgarkov was not confessing failure. He was doing what the best strategic analysts do. He was seeing the structure of the competition clearly and tracing its logic to a conclusion that the competition had not yet reached. The conclusion was correct. Subscribe if you want the next chapter. The people who understood the Cold War most clearly were not always the ones making the decisions. Sometimes they were the ones being removed for the clarity of their understanding.